Video 21, Part 20C of 25, Outputs from the Identify Risks process. The purpose of this video is to develop a WBS to present the deliverables from the Identify Risks process. The Identify Risks process is the second process in the Project Risk Management knowledge area and is related to the Planning Process group. Please click the like button. Subscribe to my channel and share with others. Thank you. How important is the risk register output in the Identify Risks process? This is a fundamental question in project risk management. The risk register is not just an output of the Identify Risks process, it is the single most critical and foundational output. To put it simply, the primary purpose of the Identify Risks process is to create and populate the initial version of the risk register. If this process concludes without producing a risk register, the process has effectively failed and all subsequent risk management processes become impossible. Here's a detailed breakdown of its importance. 1. It serves as the central repository of all identified risks. The risk register is the single source of truth for all potential threats and opportunities, that is, negative and positive risks, that may impact the project. It consolidates information from various techniques like brainstorming, interviews, SWOT analysis, and checklists into one accessible document. 2. It provides the foundation for all subsequent risk management processes. The Identify Risks process is the first in a series of 6. The risk register is the vital input that allows the following processes to happen. First, perform qualitative risk analysis. It is not possible to prioritize risks, classifying them as high, medium, or low, without a list of them. The register is the list that will be analyzed. Second, perform quantitative risk analysis. You cannot run numerical simulations on the overall project risk without a defined set of individual risks to model. Third, plan risk responses. You cannot develop strategies to handle threats, such as mitigate, avoid, OU transfer, or opportunities, such as exploit, share, OU enhance, if you don't know what they are. The risk register is the target list for response planning. Fourth, implement risk responses and monitor risks. The register becomes the tracking tool to monitor the effectiveness of your responses and to identify any new risks that emerge. 3. It captures essential information for informed decision-making. A well-developed initial risk register contains more than just a list of risk names. It typically includes, first, risk ID. This is a unique identifier for tracking. Second, risk description. This is a clear statement of the risk, including its cause and potential effect, such as the if-then structure. Third, risk category. Risks are classified as technical, external, organizational, or project management to help group and understand sources of risk. Fourth, potential responses. Sometimes, an obvious initial response is noted during identification. Fifth, risk owners. The person or team responsible for monitoring and managing the risk is often assigned early on. 4. It fosters proactive rather than reactive management. By formally documenting risks, the project team shifts from a mindset of putting out fires to one of preventing fires. It makes the team proactive. The very act of creating the register encourages foresight, critical thinking, and open communication about what could go right or wrong. 5. It enhances communication and stakeholder confidence. The risk register is a key communication tool. Sharing it, in an appropriate format, with stakeholders demonstrates that the project team is diligent, transparent, and in control. It manages expectations by showing that uncertainties have been considered and are being managed, which builds confidence in the project's leadership. How can a poor risk register output harm the identify risks process? A poor risk register doesn't just make the identify risks process less effective. It actively undermines it and creates a cascade of negative consequences throughout the entire project. Think of the identify risks process as a fishing net. A good risk register is a strong, fine meshed net that catches almost everything. A poor risk register is a net full of holes, allowing risks to swim right by, while also being cluttered with things that aren't even fish. Here's how a poor risk register output specifically harms the identify risks process in the project. 1. It creates a false sense of security. This is the most dangerous harm. If the team believes they have done a thorough job because they have a completed risk register, they will assume the major threats have been identified. This complacency blinds them to the real, uncaptured risks that are now unknown unknowns, making the project vulnerable to unexpected and potentially catastrophic issues. 2. It renders subsequent risk processes ineffective or misleading. The identify risks process is the foundation. If the foundation is cracked, everything built on top is unstable, as follows. First, qualitative analysis. You end up prioritizing a list of irrelevant or poorly defined risks. You might pour resources into mitigating a minor risk while a major one goes completely unaddressed. Second, quantitative analysis. Any numerical analysis, like Monte Carlo simulations, will be garbage in, garbage out. The results will not reflect the project's true risk exposure, leading to flawed contingency plans and budget allocations. Third, risk response planning. The team develops brilliant strategies for the wrong problems. This is a massive waste of time and resources and does nothing to protect the project's objectives. 3. It wastes valuable time and resources. A poor risk register leads to inefficiency in two ways. First, during identification, team time is wasted in meetings documenting vague, duplicate, or non-risks. Second, during execution, the project team will inevitably be forced to switch to firefighting mode, dealing with crises that should have been identified and planned for. Reactive problem solving is almost always more expensive and time-consuming than proactive risk management. 4. It kills team engagement and psychological safety. The identify risks process relies on open, honest communication. A poor risk register can stifle this. For example, if vague risks are accepted, team members who raised specific, valid concerns feel ignored and are less likely to speak up again. If it becomes a blame list, if risks are written as risk, the developer might make a mistake. Instead of risk, due to unclear requirements, the code module might contain defects. It creates a culture of fear and blame, discouraging participation. If it's seen as a bureaucratic exercise, when the register is filled with trivial items, team members lose faith in the entire risk management process and stop contributing meaningfully. 5. Specific characteristics and their direct harm. Below, we describe the characteristics of an inadequate risk register and how it harms the risk identification process. First, vague and poorly defined risks. For example, a risk such as bad weather or scope creep makes it impossible to analyze or plan for. The team doesn't know what it's really looking for or mitigating. Second, duplication of risks. If there are multiple entries for the same main risk, this wastes analysis effort and distorts the perceived frequency or impact of a risk, leading to incorrect prioritization. Third, listing issues, not risks, including current problems and assets corrupts the process. Risk identification is intended for future uncertainties, not current problems. This turns risk management into firefighting. Fourth, lack of essential information. If the risk has no cause, effect, or owner, it is unactionable. Without a cause, you can't find the root. Without an owner, no one is responsible for it. The process becomes a list-making exercise, not a management one. Fifth, absence of positive risks. If there are no opportunities listed, the process becomes purely defensive. The team fails to identify potential upsides that could benefit the project in terms of cost, time, or performance. Sixth, excess of low-priority risks. If there are too many low-priority risks, this creates noise that obscures the high-priority signals. The team is overwhelmed with trivia and misses the big project-killing threats. In conclusion, the importance of the risk register as the output of the identify risks process cannot be overstated. It is the critical link between identifying what could happen and actively managing those possibilities to protect and enhance the project's objectives. It transforms abstract concerns into manageable items and is the very embodiment of proactive project management. On the other hand, a poor risk register doesn't just represent a failure of the identify risks process, it becomes an active liability. It gives the illusion of control while systematically blinding the project team to real dangers. It corrupts all downstream planning, wastes resources, demotivates the team, and ultimately sets the project up for failure by ensuring that the biggest surprises will be unpleasant ones. In essence, a poor risk register makes the entire rigorous exercise of identify risks pointless and dangerous. How important is the risk report output in the identify risks process? This is an excellent question that gets to the heart of effective risk management. The risk report is critically important in the identify risks process. It is not just a minor output. It is the primary mechanism for communicating the initial risk landscape to stakeholders and for laying the foundation for all subsequent risk management activities. The risk report is fundamentally important because it transforms a simple list of risks, which is the risk register, into a meaningful, actionable narrative for decision makers. It provides the initial, big picture of project risk. The importance of the risk report from the identify risks process can be broken down into several key areas. 1. It provides context and a strategic overview. While the risk register is a detailed repository of individual risks, the risk report synthesizes this information to answer high-level questions as follows. First, what is the overall risk exposure of the project? Is it high risk, medium risk, or low risk? Second, where are the risk hotspots? Are most of the risks concentrated in a specific work package, technology, or with a particular vendor? Third, what are the key sources of risk? For example, the sources of risk can be technical complexity, market volatility, or stakeholder conflicts. Fourth, what are the overarching trends? For example, a trend could be, we are seeing a cluster of risks related to the new regulatory framework. This strategic overview is essential for project sponsors and senior management who may not have the time to review hundreds of individual risk entries. 2. It is a foundational communication tool. The identify risks process often involves workshops and interviews with many team members. The risk report is the formal output that communicates the findings of this collaborative effort to a wider audience as follows. First, it sets a common understanding. It ensures that everyone, from the project team to the steering committee, starts with the same baseline understanding of the project's threats and opportunities. Second, it justifies next steps. It provides the rationale for why the project needs to invest time and resources in the subsequent processes of qualitative and quantitative risk analysis and plan risk responses. 3. It informs early decision-making. Even at this early stage, the risk report can trigger crucial decisions as follows. First, go, no-go decisions. A risk report revealing an overwhelming number of high-impact threats might lead an organization to cancel a project before significant funds are spent. Second, scope and strategy refinement. Identifying major risks might lead to changes in project approach, technology selection, or contractual strategies before detailed planning is complete. Third, resource allocation. It highlights areas that will need more robust contingency plans or more experienced personnel. 4. It serves as a baseline for future comparison. The risk report created during Identify Risks is a snapshot in time. As the project progresses, new risk reports are generated. Comparing the initial report with later versions allows stakeholders to see. The first question is how the risk landscape is evolving. Another question is whether the risk responses are effective. And the last question is whether new, more significant risks are emerging. This creates a powerful feedback loop for the project's health. 5. Risk report content. To illustrate its importance, consider what the report typically contains at this stage. First, summary of identified risks, a high-level overview of the total number of risks, often categorized, such as by type or by WBS element. Second, sources of risk, the root causes that are generating the most significant risks. Third, potential risk owners, a preliminary list of individuals or groups who might be best suited to manage key risks. Fourth, list of assumptions and constraints. These are often significant sources of risk themselves. Fifth, key risk categories, showing where risks are concentrated. Sixth, recommendations for next steps, suggesting the focus for qualitative analysis or areas needing further investigation. How can a poor risk report output harm the Identify Risks process? A poor risk report doesn't just fail to add value, it actively harms the Identify Risks process and the project's overall health. It creates a cascade of negative consequences that can undermine risk management from the very start. Here's how a poor risk report output harms the Identify Risks process. 1. It creates a false sense of security. A report that is vague, incomplete, or fails to highlight high-priority risks can lead management to believe the project is less risky than it actually is. This results in complacency and a lack of urgency for further risk analysis. Conversely, a report that is poorly structured and presents every minor issue as a catastrophe can create unnecessary alarm and panic, leading to misallocated resources and poor decision-making. 2. It undermines the credibility of the entire process. If the report is poorly written, lacks data, or is filled with jargon, stakeholders, especially sponsors and senior management, will dismiss it. They may view the Identify Risks process as a check-the-box exercise rather than a critical management function. As a result, when the process loses credibility, it becomes incredibly difficult to secure support and resources for the subsequent risk analysis and response planning activities. 3. It leads to misinformed and poor strategic decisions. The primary purpose of the risk report is to inform decision makers. A poor report, lacking clear sources of risk, trends, and hotspots, provides a flawed foundation for key early decisions about project scope, funding, and strategy. For example, a company might green-light a project based on a risk report that buried a critical technological feasibility risk, leading to massive cost overruns later. 4. It fails to engage key stakeholders and risk owners. A dry, unactionable list of risks does not engage people. If the report doesn't tell a compelling story about why risks matter and who is affected, stakeholders will not feel a sense of ownership or urgency. As a result, potential risk owners disengage, making it difficult to assign and manage risks in the next phases. Stakeholders may withhold crucial information because they don't see their concerns reflected in the official report. 5. It wastes the effort of the Identify Risks team. The Identify Risks process often involves time-consuming workshops and interviews. A poor report fails to synthesize and communicate the team's hard work effectively. The valuable insights gathered are lost in a poorly structured document. As a result, the team feels their effort was wasted, leading to demotivation and reduced participation in future risk activities. The organizational learning is lost. 6. It provides a weak or flawed baseline for future comparison. The initial risk report serves as a baseline. If it's inaccurate or incomplete, you cannot effectively measure how the risk landscape is changing. You can't tell if things are getting better or worse because your starting point was wrong. As a result, the project loses a key tool for tracking its health and the effectiveness of its risk responses. In conclusion, the risk report is not merely an administrative output. It is a vital strategic document that ensures the risks identified by the team are effectively communicated, understood, and acted upon by the people who guide the project. Without a strong risk report, the Identify Risks process risks becoming an academic exercise, with its valuable findings failing to influence project strategy and decision-making. In contrast, a poor risk report breaks the critical link between identification and action. It takes the collective intelligence gathered during the Identify Risks process and fails to translate it into a format that drives understanding, decision-making, and accountability. It doesn't just render the process ineffective, it actively misleads the project, sowing the seeds for future crises that could have been managed proactively. As a final message, a strong risk report is the catalyst that turns risk identification into risk management. A poor one ensures that the identified risks remain unmanaged threats. How important is the project documents updates output in the Identify Risks process? The project documents updates are extremely important. While it may seem like a bureaucratic formality, updating project documents is a critical and practical activity. It ensures that the risk identification process is not an isolated event but is integrated into the ongoing management of the project. The value isn't in creating the output itself, but in the action of updating the documents with newfound risk-related information. The Identify Risks process is about generating a comprehensive list of potential risks and their characteristics. This intelligence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is derived from and directly impacts almost every other aspect of the project. The project documents updates output is the mechanism that feeds this intelligence back into the project's knowledge base. Here's why that is so crucial. 1. It creates a living, breathing risk register. The most obvious document updated is the risk register. However, Identify Risks can also update the following documents. First, assumption log. During risk identification, you often find that your initial assumptions were incorrect, overly optimistic, or incomplete. Updating the assumption log with new assumptions or revised ones is vital for project stability. For example, you might have assumed a key resource would be available, but now you identify a risk that they might be reassigned. Second, issue log. Sometimes, what starts as a potential risk, or an uncertainty, is identified as a current issue, or a certainty that must be dealt with now. The issue log must be updated immediately to address it. Third, lessons learned register, capturing how risks were identified, such as the brainstorming session with the operations team was highly effective, improves the process for the current and future projects. 2. It enhances situational awareness and fills information gaps. Risk identification often reveals gaps in your project's foundational documents. Updating them closes these gaps and improves overall project understanding, as follows. First, requirements documentation and user stories. You might identify a risk related to a specific requirement being ambiguous or conflicting. Updating the document to clarify the requirement proactively mitigates that risk. Second, stakeholder register. As you analyze risks, you might identify new stakeholders, such as a compliance officer for a newly identified regulatory risk, or realize a current stakeholder's influence or attitude is different than initially thought. 3. It provides traceability and context for future decisions. A risk identified today might not become relevant for months. Updated project documents provide the essential context for why a future decision is made. For example, 6 months into a project, the team is considering a change request. By reviewing the updated assumption log and risk register, they can immediately see if this change exacerbates a known risk or violates a key assumption made during planning. This leads to more informed and robust decision-making. 4. It's a key tool for iterative and adaptive project management. In agile or iterative environments, risk identification is continuous. Updating documents like the backlog, which is a key project document, with risk-related user stories or spikes ensures that risk response is built directly into the work, making the project more resilient. How can a poor project document's updates output harm the identify risks process? A poor project document's updates output doesn't just create administrative overhead. It actively undermines the effectiveness of the entire identify risks process and creates tangible, negative consequences for the project. Here's how a failure in this area directly harms the risk management process. 1. It creates a disconnected and myopic risk register. The risk register becomes an isolated list, detached from the project's reality, as follows. For example, risks are recorded without the crucial context from the assumption log, issue log, or stakeholder register. A risk like potential delay from vendor is far less useful if it's not directly linked to the specific assumption in the assumption log that vendor will deliver within 4-week lead time. As a result, the project team loses the why behind the risk, making it harder to analyze and plan effective responses later. 2. It allows foundational flaws to persist. The whole point of identifying risks is to find and fix weaknesses in the project plan. A poor update process means these weaknesses remain. For example, the team identifies that a key requirement is ambiguous, that is a risk, but the requirements documentation is never updated to clarify it. As a result, the ambiguity persists, causing rework, scope creep, and conflicts later. The team identified the risk but failed to inoculate the project against it by updating the source document. 3. It breaks the feedback loop for continuous risk identification. Risk identification is not a one-time event. A poor update process means the process doesn't learn or improve. For example, the lessons learned register isn't updated with what techniques worked well, such as the interview with the subject matter expert revealed the most critical risks. As a result, the next risk identification workshop uses the same ineffective methods, missing key risks again. The project fails to get smarter about its own risk management. 4. It leads to reactive, not proactive, management. Without updated documents, the early warning systems fail. For example, a risk trigger, documented in the assumption log, such as, if team velocity drops below 20 story points, the schedule is at risk, is ignored. The velocity drops, but because the log wasn't actively used and updated, no one is alerted. As a result, the team is caught by surprise when the risk becomes an issue. They are forced to react to a problem that could have been mitigated, leading to firefighting and crisis mode. 5. It causes knowledge silos and amnesia. When documents aren't updated, critical risk information exists only in people's heads, emails, or meeting notes. For example, a key stakeholder expresses a major concern during a risk workshop, but the stakeholder register isn't updated to reflect their heightened resistance. As a result, when that stakeholder later blocks a critical decision, the project manager is blindsided. The institutional knowledge of their attitude was lost because it wasn't formally captured. 6. It wastes the effort of the identify risks process. This is the ultimate harm. The entire exercise becomes a pointless check-the-box activity. For example, the team spends hours in a brainstorming session, identifies 50 risks, and the project manager dutifully adds them to the risk register. However, none of the connected documents, such as assumption log, issue log, etc., are refined based on the insights gained. As a result, the project gains a false sense of security, such as "we've done our risk identification," without realizing that the process was rendered ineffective by the failure to integrate the findings back into the project's DNA. In conclusion, the project documents updates output is the vital feedback loop that makes the identify risks process valuable beyond just creating a list. It transforms risk identification from a theoretical exercise into a practical, integrated management activity that improves the quality of all project documents, ensures continuity and knowledge retention, and enables proactive, rather than reactive, project management. Ignoring this output would mean allowing your project's core documentation to become outdated and irrelevant, severely limiting your ability to manage risks effectively throughout the project lifecycle. On the other hand, a poor project documents updates output doesn't just create messy paperwork. It severs the vital connections between risk identification and active project management, ensuring that the project remains vulnerable to the very risks it already took the time to find. This video is finished, but we will have in the next videos. 1. Creation of WBS for different projects using WBS Schedule Pro. 2. Examples of project plans using MS Project. And many more videos. Don't forget to give a thumbs up if you like this video and want us to continue with new topics. Subscribe to the channel. All content is free. You can also comment suggesting topics you would like to see on this channel. Thank you.